Hello everyone and welcome to this presentation on what's new in Connect version 1.7. In this series of 3 videos, we'll be taking a look at all of the new features that have been added in the software in this version. It's important to note that this is a somewhat minor release. There's no big new feature that's involved. There's just a lot of quality of life improvements and a lot of little things that will simply be pretty awesome. So first, let's take a look at the new features that are available in the workflow configuration tool. So these are fairly straightforward and relatively minor. So first of all, let's take a look at this process here that has a run script task. If you have a lot of conditions in your process, this little thing will be super awesome. If I right-click here, for example, on Create File and go into Properties, and I go into comments, you are already able to add comments here like job info to file. This is what the create file does. But this new option at the bottom is called use as task description. Clicking that and hitting OK will change the description right under the task name to what you put in. That can be 1 or 2 lines depending on how much text you put in. If I right-click on the run script action, which particularly has the advanced properties, in which I can do this, return specials to client. So I do that, use task description, and boom. So you can more easily identify any task that you have. Let me show that to you in a condition. So if I have a condition with 2 strings here and I click OK, well, it just says string 1 contains S2, or, it's not super useful. But if I do here and I do ASD equals ASD, then it immediately becomes a lot more useful. The second option is very specifically for the Connect All-in-One plugin. I don't really have a process that has this task in it because, the All-in-One is the easy way to output a one-off job that doesn't need any special workflow processing. So this is available anywhere. It runs DataMapper, content creation, output creation with no job, by the way, as a reminder. And then it generates the output. Now the all-in-one, since it doesn't need any interaction with workflow, when you run it, it doesn't actually return metadata, it doesn't return IDs, it doesn't do anything. Everything is done on the server. The advantage of the all-in-one plugin is that it can run things in parallel. Now this new option that we have here is called Do Not Store Records in Database. And the option even tells you why this is. It is faster. Because as the all-in-one plugin is running, let's say it has 10,000 records to run, and it does them in parallel, generating all the output and all the stuff. Now, if you were to not check this option, so if the records are generated in the database, it means 10,000 records and 10,000 content items are generated in the database, and they will stay there until cleanup. Obviously, if you're not storing anything, it means you're using less space. It means it doesn't have to take the time to write to the database, and thus it is faster. Obviously, if this option is enabled, you can no longer retrieve items for that specific job. But in a lot of cases, all-in-one is mostly used for one-shot big jobs that you just want the output and then you don't want to think about it again. In this case, it is perfect. The very last option that we have in the workflow is a new option in Retrieve Items. So here I have my standard Retrieve Items, which is getting specific records filtered by a user ID. What this new option does is, if I step through and get those items I can view as text, is return this in the JSON format. Don't worry about the text that you're seeing here. Essentially, this is the standard JavaScript exchange format, which is that if you send a request to the workflow server and you tell it, hey, I want you to give me all of the invoices for a specific client, but you don't want the PDFs, you don't want a print job, you just basically want the information that is processed by a web front end, you could use this option. What I mean by a web front end is basically anything that processes JavaScript and even backends. Anything that is Node.js, anything that's a CMS, anything that's a web front end, any custom built solution. If you can retrieve it and use JSON or JavaScript, you can do that. I would love to show you one example of that. However, it would require me to have a front end system and build a template and build a lot of things that go beyond the scope of showing what Connect and Workflow can do. But just keep in mind that you can now retrieve items in a JSON format, and anyone that knows that format will know that it's a pretty good option. Now let's move on to the DataMapper module. There's a couple of new options in DataMapper. Again, nothing major, which is why I'm combining the video with the workflow one, but still quality of life and useful improvements. First off, let's take a look at the new ability to make an HTTP request to any server. What I mean by that is that in order to complement data, you can now make a request to any web server, which includes workflow, in order to grab additional data for that specific record and then to use it inside of the data mapping configuration or within Designer. So let's take a look at exactly what I have here. Let me go into my extraction task here, and I will open the specific field that is called specials. Now, this is code, and I don't like showing code in new feature requests, but I do have to in this case. Essentially, this is the new API feature. When you do a create HTTP request, and you can use a get, post, delete, put, anything that is supported by the HTTP protocol to grab information and then use it inside of the steps. So what I'm doing here essentially is that I am grabbing information from a local workflow process, and I'm putting that information inside of the data model. So this is information coming from workflow. Let me go back to workflow just for a second and show you what that does. This is that run script thing that I was doing. It's receiving a request with a number of items inside of an invoice, and it's doing some special magic scripting thing, and it's returning that data to the front end. Now, if I had retrieve items here, I could retrieve items from the database. I will also have a future video that shows you how to use the data repository API in order to grab data and then return it as JSON. We're starting a lot of new JSON things in Connect and in Workflow, so learning about JSON is a good idea at this point, by the way, as a small parenthesis. Now back to the data mapper. So I'm extracting the data, putting it in specials, and then presumably I could use this in the front end. It's as easy as that. Now I could grab data from any online website, any online system, any internal system, and this does not need to be JSON. It could be HTML, it could be XML, it could be just normal text, it can be an image. Anything that is supported in from the web will work here. So the possibilities are almost literally endless in what you can do. Now on to the second option, which is actually an action task that I have here. But before showing you the action, I want to show you a small condition. What I have is a condition based on the total, and I'm saying if the invoice for this client is less than $50,000, I do not want to send them an invoice. So I have a condition here, and within this condition, I have an action. If the total is less than 50,000, stop processing record. So this is a new option that is in the action step in 1.7, and using that means if it's less than 50,000, such as the very first record inside of my data source, then it does not extract anything. It stops processing the record. Now, one note is that if I put the extraction at the top, so if I have extractions before I stop processing records, those extractions will still work. Now, what does this mean exactly? If you stop processing a record before any field is extracted, so if the whole thing is grayed out and you have no record, when you actually run this inside of an actual job, so if you produce output or you're using this in the workflow automation, that record simply will not exist. So why is this a good thing? Well, if you're grabbing data from a source and you're not able to filter the data coming in, you might want to remove these records in order for them not to produce content items, not to produce output, not to produce anything. Now, obviously, you could filter those out in the job presets, which are part of the output module. However, the advantage here is that the record itself is not produced. It does not go in the database. The content item is never produced, does not go in the database. And, things like record counts will always be filtered out directly. So it's a question of efficiency. If half of your records for a specific job are filtered out using this method, it means half of the processing from create content item, create job, create output will also not be processed, and thus making the job faster. The last thing that I want to show you is common to both the DataMapper and the designer. You might have noticed that there's a fresh coat of paint that's been added to the data model pane. All these icons have been remodeled so that they look a little nicer. There's even a new icon here called Show Extra Data. If you don't recall, extra data is a very useful blank field. You can't put information in here from the DataMapper. However, what you can do is you can put information there from workflow, from any automation system. So it's kind of an extra field that you can use as an emergency to add things or complement your data from workflow. So this hides or shows it depending on whether or not you're using it, pretty much. The other thing that's changed is that the record navigation is now at the complete top of the data model, which means when I skip, it's always going to be at the top. Now, this is even more visible, even more useful when you're in Designer. So let's switch to Designer. And as you can see, what happens here is if I go to the bottom, I still have this nice little record navigation that I can go. And very lastly, again, in the DataMapper and Designer combined, if you select one or more fields and you right-click, you now have the option to collapse the fields, and this will temporarily hide them. They're still going to be extracted. If you're extracting them, they still have their values. They're not deleted. They're just hidden, and then you can expand them again to show them. It's kind of useful if, for example, you are working a lot with the record. You want to just, hide a couple of fields so you have access to the detail table. You can do that. So that was all for the video about the workflow and DataMapper. The next video will be about the designer, so see you in a few clicks.